Um, Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Aileen Ionescu-Summers. I'm GEM Executive Director, and this is our fourth webinar concerning the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And I'm delighted to have two experts from GEM national teams with us today. The first is Donna Kelley. She's the Professor of Entrepreneurship at Babson College. Babson College is a founding university of GEM, and it's also a global sponsor of GEM. And then we also have Peter Josty. He's from GEM Canada, and he's the Executive Director of the Centre for Innovation Studies. And later on, we'll be talking about the very different impacts and also the similarities between what's happening in the United States as regards entrepreneurship and also as regards entrepreneurship in Canada. First, though, for those who do not know GEM, I would like to very quickly just explain again what GEM is. It's a consortium of national teams. Donna and Peter represent the United States and Canada, but we have upwards of 50 national teams that participate with us in our research. And it's a consortium that associates with top academic institutions and financing partners, which mostly are governments. We carry out survey-based research. GEM, in fact, is the only global research source that collects data on entrepreneurship directly from individual entrepreneurs. And we carry out two surveys. The first is the Adult Population Survey, which provides analysis on characteristics, motivations and ambitions of individuals starting businesses, as well as the social attitudes towards entrepreneurship. And then the second survey that we carry out is the National Expert Survey. It looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. These two surveys allow us to develop tools and data that are certainly unique, and they benefit numerous stakeholders. GEM actually got off the ground over 21 years ago, so 21 years of robust research behind us. As I mentioned earlier, it was a joint project initially between Babson College and London Business School. And we have actually surveyed, would you believe, over 3 million adults in 114 economies across the globe over that time. We carry out about 150,000 surveys a year. As I mentioned, 50 economies participated in 2019. This really does indicate that GEM is a highly credible source of data and information around entrepreneurship. We work with hundreds of specialists in entrepreneurship research and multiple academic and research institutions, as well as the funding institutions. So what we are going to do today, we're going to cover several areas in this area of entrepreneurship. We have in our previous webinars where we looked at several other countries, we've always asked the question about the 2008 financial crisis in particular and the lead up that we've had now towards the COVID-19 crisis. So Donna, could I start with you? Of late, I think we can agree that the world seems to move from crisis to crisis. It was never so true, right? And so we have had financial, humanitarian, environmental crises. But at least one good thing is that we learn along the way. So with that in mind, can you give us a bit of an overview on impact and reactions of entrepreneurs in the USA as a result of the very serious financial crisis of 2007-2008? And let's see if we can make some deductions from that for this particular crisis. Donna. You have to unmute yourself, Donna.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, what's interesting is, I mean, the United States has been through a lot of recessions, some with greater severity than others, but probably this 2007, 2008 economic crisis was the most significant one so far since we started GEM. And so what we see, as you can see in this yellow shaded part of the slide, and thank you, Forrest, for coordinating these slides. The TEA rate is the blue line, and we had you know, a fairly high rate of entrepreneurship that really took a dive and
Oh.
and then we had a bump up, and it's been increasing since then, but certainly we saw an effect on TEA. In the orange line, you see the established business rates, you know, obviously declined in 2009, but we saw really more of a lag effect where the decline really, TEA and EB. TEA is total entrepreneurial activity. Those are the percentage of the adult population between 18 and 64 that are in the process of starting a business or running a new business less than 3.5 years old, and EB stands for established business ownership. Those are greater than 3.5 years old. And remember that one quality of GEM is that we are looking at the entrepreneurs, not necessarily the number of businesses, but the number of entrepreneurs. So thank you for that question, that clarifying question. So as I was saying, with established business activity, you see a decline in 2012 that continued through 2014. And we can imagine that this decline resulted from earlier lower startup rates. So next slide for us. The next slide shows that what really happened also was the nature of activity. We have typically tracked necessity motivated entrepreneurs, those that are starting businesses because they have no other choices for work, and then those that are simply choosing to pursue an opportunity. And what we see here during the recession in 2010 and before that 2009 was that the opportunity motivated entrepreneurs were really dropping out. Necessity entrepreneurship increase and continued to increase all the way through 2013. And we can imagine that's because the environment is so much less amenable to startup businesses. Consumers aren't buying, they don't have as much discretionary spending, or they're being more cautious. Investors are pulling out from high risk investments. Suppliers might be a little bit hesitant to work with new companies. So the environment is really not optimal. But you have people that have not been able to regain employment or aren't able to find employment even after the recession, because some of those jobs didn't come back. You know, the opportunity motivated, or the would-be entrepreneurs that would be opportunity motivated, might choose to wait it out a little bit. They may decide, I'm going to stay with the job I have now because I need that stability.
Okay, and so could we conclude that from the outcomes, you know, of these graphs and the conclusions of the GEM research, that entrepreneurship is a viable option for contributing to rebooting economies, getting them back off the ground?
Yeah, we might think about the necessity motivated entrepreneurs, and it might, entrepreneurship presents a good opportunity for filling employment gaps. I mean, when we've tracked necessity entrepreneurship in GEM, we generally find that entrepreneurs are mostly opportunity motivated, no matter what country you look at, but there's a higher proportion of necessity motivated entrepreneurs in the countries that are in the earlier phases of economic development. And so we expect in the United States, necessity motivations, especially when we're in a situation of full employment, will be quite low. But we can see necessity as being also kind of an employment gap filler, and as we saw during this recession. I can also show you, can you go to the next slide, Forrest? There's also what I found, I was just looking at this the other day, as we're working on the US report, that, you know, there isn't really a lot of entrepreneurial activity in the medium or high tech sector. We have to admit, people starting businesses are, you know, generally the ones you see around them, but the medium and high tech sector tends to get a lot more press, a lot more media attention. But really interestingly, by 2010, we weren't picking up any entrepreneurs starting in that medium or high tech sector. I think I might have had one more slide for us. Did I have one more? Oh yeah, this was also an important one. And you know, one of the strengths of GEM, one of the many, is that we track societal attitudes. And often societal attitudes say a lot, not only about the potential for entrepreneurship, maybe we could see it as a leading indicator for actions later on, but also just around societal support. So if, for example, you see fear of failure coming up, you might imagine that there is a little bit, in terms of the society being less willing to take risks. And we did see fear of failure really come up just after the recession. It started to come down, but interestingly, even in the past few years, it's continued to rise. So that's, I think, some of the learning points around the economic crisis, and we can talk at any point about whether we think these lessons are really applicable in the face of COVID.
Okay, I'll just mention at this stage, by the way, that should you have questions, to enter those questions in the Q&A part, the questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom application, and we'll be addressing those questions later on. Can I turn to you, Peter, at this stage? Perhaps you could talk about Canada in the lead up to the COVID-19 crisis, and maybe also refer to sort of regional differences.
Thanks, Eileen. Good morning, everyone, from a sunny Calgary. As you know, as most of you know, GEM measures 3 dimensions of entrepreneurship: the attitudes, activity, and aspirations. And if you look at Canada, the attitudes are really what the whole population thinks about entrepreneurship. And we have a very positive view from Canada. 7 out of 10 Canadians think that entrepreneurship's a good career choice. 8 out of 10 think successful entrepreneurs have high status, and 3/4 of Canadians believe that the entrepreneurial success attracts a lot of media attention. So it's a very supportive public view of entrepreneurship in Canada. If you look at actually the activity, what's going on, we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years a steady rise in entrepreneurship in Canada. Last year, we found, just before the COVID outbreak, we had a TEA rate, as Donna was mentioning, of 18.2%, which means that 18% of the Canadian population was engaged in planning or early stages of a new business. Our ownership of established businesses is only 7%. So there's quite a gap between the number of businesses that start and the number that are actually in existence. And that speaks to quite a high exit rate. So we got a lot of churn of small businesses. We also in GEM look at the motivation of entrepreneurs, why they start businesses. And the biggest single motivation for Canadian entrepreneurs last year was to make a difference in the world. And this is different from most countries, because in most countries it's to make a lot of money.
Right.
So if you look at aspirations, most Canadian entrepreneurs employ 1 to 5 people. And if you look at who are actually the entrepreneurs in Canada, it's the 25 to 34 age group is the peak year for starting a business. Entrepreneurs in Canada are also very highly educated. 25% of them have some degree of graduate education. And women start businesses at 77% of the male rate, which is the average of the last 2 years. So we've seen a steady increase in women's entrepreneurship since we started doing these studies in 2013, where it was only 60%. So Eileen asked about the regional variations. Of course, Canada is a very large country. It's got a lot of different communities. So what we find in general terms is that entrepreneurship increases from east to west across the country. And so there are a lot of regional differences that we pick up in the GEM reports.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I just saw a question there as to whether we had charts for Canada, and I just want to point you towards our annual report, which you'll find on the GEM website, gemconsortium.org. And there you'll find a lot of country-specific information. So can I just maybe ask you a similar question, Donna? Well, you know, what kind of snapshot, can you give us a snapshot of the entrepreneur context just pre-crisis, before we move to the impact in the crisis?
Right, yeah. I mean, we were getting increases, as you see. Forrest, can you turn back to that first slide where we had TEA and established businesses? So actually what we see in 2019 is we have the highest TEA rate in 21 years. Established business activity looks like the highest we've seen. So 1/3 of the entrepreneurs expect to create 6 or more jobs, new jobs in the next 5 years. 30% are introducing innovative concepts. You know, again, we don't know yet what will happen, you know, with the 2020 results. We haven't started the survey yet. We're really interested in seeing the impact of COVID on entrepreneurship. But before the crisis, things were looking really pretty good in the US.
Yeah, and so that brings us really to talking about the current crisis that we're in. What are the characteristics of this crisis that actually make it, a lot of people say this is a crisis with a difference, a crisis like no other. So maybe, again, with you, Donna, perhaps can you outline what you think makes it different? Yeah.
Well, we know in history that a lot of businesses have started during recessions. Walt Disney started in 1929, at the beginning of the Great Depression. Microsoft was started around the recession that started around the oil embargo in 1975. In 2008, when we had our last big recession, we had Groupon, Uber, WhatsApp, Slack, Venmo, Airbnb. A lot of businesses started around that time. And personally, I started my first business in 1982 during a recession. I joined a technology startup in 91 during a recession. And we could think about the advantages. You know, my first business, we got really good lease terms because the mall that we went into, it was actually Martial Arts School Health Club. There was a lot of space available. We got good terms for a lease. The interest rates might be low. There's less competition. There may be new needs like we definitely see with COVID. The pool of qualified employees might be really large. So there can be some advantages. This situation is very different. I think when we look around us, we see that most of the world has been on a lockdown. Recessions in the past, you know, weighed heavily on businesses, but they were still operating. Those that were continuing to be successful. Here, many businesses were forced to shut down, right? Some businesses were able to adapt, like some of you might have done takeout, or you were able to order things online. Other businesses were thriving, and the bike shop I usually go to is selling a lot of bicycles. And they're doing a lot of repairs. There's a 3-week delay if you want to get your bike repaired. And I tell you, you know, people's behavior is changing like no other. During an economic recession, we might be pulling back and saying, okay, I'm not going to go to the movies as often. I'm not going to go out to eat as often because I want to, save my money. But in this recession, the behaviors of society, whether opportunistic or compelled to do so, are really changing. And the effect on business is much different depending on what you're doing.
Very interesting. Peter, would you say that Canada, you're observing the same kind of phenomenon, or are there some Canada-specific aspects that we could look at?
I think what Donna said pretty much applies to Canada as well.
Okay.
Some of the differences in Canada from the last recession, I think the first thing is that the overall scale of it. If you look at government spending, it's on a per capita basis, it's twice as much as the previous one.
Yeah.
And they're talking about a biggest budget deficit since the Second World War. So the impact on the economy as a whole just been enormous. The other thing that's interesting in Canada is that there's been a lot of public money supporting business, and where it's going is different from last time. Where the last recession, most of the government support went to big companies. It was bailouts of automotive firms, that kind of thing. This time, most of the money is going to individuals, and the money that's going to big companies is, I think, quite restrained. It's in the form of loans, and it's very interesting that some of the loans have conditions, and the conditions are very interesting because they will lend money provided companies meet certain environmental goals. So they're using the crisis to move forward in a green agenda, if you like.
Right.
So it's pretty much the same as the US, but a few distinctive changes for Canada.
Okay, and Donna, would you say the US, is that split similar regarding, where the money is going? Is it going to big business? Is it going to entrepreneurs? Is it balanced? What's your view?
Well, there is a focus on helping small business. There's over $700 million was voted in to, we're calling it the part of the CARE Act, to help small businesses get through these times. A survey by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that 43% of businesses have temporarily closed, and most businesses have reduced their employee counts by at least 40%. So a lot of the focus on the US, recognizing the importance to employment of small business, a lot of focus on saving jobs in the small business sector.
Right.
And so the government generally does not play a heavy hand in terms of entrepreneurship. We notice that we rely a lot on the private sector for different types of financing options, and the private sector just plays a big role in accelerators and a lot of the other ecosystem components. But in this crisis, we are seeing the government certainly stepping in. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program, is oriented toward giving businesses up to $2 million to cover payroll, and they actually had to adjust that. They were requiring that 75% go to payroll, and then finding a lot of small businesses had other expenses that were greater and that could make use of the money. So they've reduced that to 60%. They've lengthened the time because actually these loans can be forgiven if they meet this criteria with, putting it toward payroll, having it all be used within now, I think 24 weeks rather than 8 weeks. And, it's just, I think, been helpful, but there's a lot of, issues around it, a lot of bureaucracy that, they're putting this all on the SBA, the Small Business Administration, to allocate, and the money comes through banks. It's a huge amount of work to allocate this money. There was some concern about some large companies getting it, kind of as Peter is mentioning. So there was a little bit of, you know, an issue with large companies getting the money, and that the businesses with 20 or fewer employees were less affected or less able to use this money. So been some positives and some negatives with that.
Okay. Peter, would you say, I mean, Donna was commenting earlier on some of the opportunities for certain sectors. Could we go a little bit deeper on that for Canada? Have you been seeing differences in impact on sectors or certain types of businesses? You were on mute. Sorry. Yes.
I think in Canada that by and large services have been affected more than manufacturing, and a lot of the impact's been similar to the US. Tourism has been shut down. I think if you look at opportunities, I would say that as Donna was mentioning, in crises, a lot of businesses, this is the time where a lot of innovations actually come to pass. Yeah. And this is the Schumpeter's creative destruction. This is what goes on at the bottom of recessions. And this is a particularly severe recession. So I'm pretty sure that coming out of this will be a lot of very interesting new firms. One of the things that I think it will accelerate is the move towards the fourth industrial revolution. We're talking about roles of artificial intelligence, robotics, and biotechnology. Just last week in Vancouver, a firm called Abcella got $105 million of venture capital funding for a COVID-19 treatment. Another example was that a Toronto-based company called Daisy Intelligence that uses artificial intelligence to help retailers forecast inventory needs. They got a lot of money. And another one in Montreal raised $100 million for repair therapeutics for a cancer treatment. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for sort of big innovations. There are also a lot of mundane things. I mean, Donna mentioned the bike shop. We're noticing that gardening stores have got a huge increase. If you want to buy some seeds to plant in your garden in Canada, really tough to find them these days because they're all getting sold out. Sales of puzzles are up 300%. We're all having our groceries, you know, either curbside pickup or delivered, and that's creating a lot of employment at that front. Just a personal example, my wife is doing piano lessons by Zoom. So this is a new thing that we've never done before, and I suspect some of these habits are going to stay with us for quite a long time. Another curious thing I saw the other day, custom-made jigsaw puzzles. So there are all kinds of opportunities for entrepreneurs, both in the sort of high-tech area and in the more mundane short-term areas.
And Donna, I know that you particularly have been thinking about the huge impacts on education. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just going back to Peter's example, my first business was, you know, exercise related, and I still teach classes. So I've been teaching on Zoom. I just tell everybody, take off your couch. We'll do push-ups, you know, on the couch, and you just need a couple of, you know, dumbbells because our gym is closed. And I think about how there might be some opportunities there. You know, what if a gym offers online classes if you're traveling or you can't get to the gym in the morning? The same thing we're seeing definitely at Babson. I mean, we had 1 week to adjust our ongoing classes while the kids students were on spring break. We had to figure out how are we moving our classes to an online. You know, as many of you that are on this this webinar have also been through, and so we had to make major changes to how we were teaching. And you know, we have probably about 240 professors all having different experience with technology. I was probably in the middle where I had some experience, but not doing it so often. But probably others with less experience. And so we all had to kind of ramp up and get good at online teaching. And it's not just about the use of technology. It's about what is the best way to do it. Do you do asynchronous versus synchronous? How do you provide tests? How do you test your students? We had, at Babson, we have the first year students starting businesses, and they had to close their businesses. So we had to come up with a different project for them during the semester. So, and I think, when we can think about what are the opportunities that our experience in the last couple of months has maybe surfaced, right? What does technology enable? But the other thing that we have to think about for all industries, and certainly education, is what are the changes going to be when we come out of this, or at least, when this crisis has lessened. So will some behaviors be permanent? I mean, I think
hopefully
before.
Yes.
Oh, is my connection okay?
It's okay, you're back now.
Good. So, we wonder, what will the impact be on education? Will students prefer to be online? Will they, what will the demand be like on the education side? And so when we look at what technology enables and what the market behavior is, we're going to have to be really quick to respond to that.
Okay. Thank you. We appear to have lost Peter. Have we lost Peter?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I just didn't see you on the screen. Sorry. Sorry, Peter. So let's turn now to the responses. You've already referred somehow to the responses from the US and Canadian governments to the crisis, how they're helping entrepreneurs versus, big business, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that GEM does is we have developed what we call the entrepreneurial framework conditions. These are sets of conditions. Actually, Donna, I'm going to ask you to maybe explain what the entrepreneurial framework conditions are, and then also to relate it to specifically the United States and
Right.
how right now, how ready is the United States to fulfill those entrepreneurial framework conditions moving forward.
Yes, the environment is really critical for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs rely on a lot of stakeholders in the environment, support from investors, suppliers, customers willing to buy from them, families that are willing to support them. And what we see in the United States is, as you might expect, a strength in finance and also strength in culture. Many of our conditions are pretty good for entrepreneurship, but some of these do shift over time. So as an entrepreneur, we look to those factors. Like right now, we're seeing more from the government side, right? So the government is providing more financial support when normally we rely more on the private sector. So during a crisis, we need to look at the fact that conditions might change. Some might stay pretty stable. But what is really hard is that entrepreneurs may be really good at getting over the barriers that you typically face. Like, I know how to maybe get around picking customer segments that are more likely to buy my product and then moving into other segments. So that if the market shifts, maybe I can, handle that. But there are other things that may be more difficult to deal with. And, of course, during 2008, we saw TEA rates drop down, and maybe it was because availability of finance was really constraining. So some of these conditions shift over time, and it's really important for entrepreneurs to be adaptive and really understand where those barriers are. But certainly we have to leverage what our strengths are, for entrepreneurship in our environment, and then continue to improve on those components that are less than ideal.
Thank you. And so, Peter, so when we carry out our national expert survey, we ask the national experts to rate these entrepreneurial framework conditions. Could you also bring us through maybe how things are looking in terms of readiness in Canada moving forward towards hopefully an economic recovery, including entrepreneurs?
Sure. One of the metrics that GEM produces is called the National Entrepreneurship Context Index. And this is sort of a composite of all of the ratings that the experts give to the quality of the, essentially the ecosystem, how well we are set up to do entrepreneurship. And if you look at that index for Canada, we're ranked second out of the G7, second after the US, and 14th overall. So at a high level, the situation in Canada in terms of the supports for entrepreneurship are pretty good. If you go a little bit deeper, then if you look at the 12 framework conditions, if you look at how important they are and how well Canada does, the biggest gaps we find are in financing, R&D transfer, which means technology developed at a university getting into the marketplace, government policies, and internal market burden. And the internal market is an interesting one because there's a perpetual problem in Canada about interprovincial trade, and this always shows up in the GEM surveys. It's often very difficult to transfer products and services from one province to another. That's one of the obstacles that Canada faces for entrepreneurship. If you look at our strengths, the strengths, as in most GEM countries, it's physical infrastructure, and in Canada, it's particularly cultural and social norms. So those are very supportive of entrepreneurship. The caveat to make, though, is that Canada is a very big country. As I mentioned before, we got a lot of different communities, so it does vary a lot across the country. So when you make countrywide generalizations, it often doesn't apply to every single province.
Okay, right, interesting. Now, if you consider governments, and governments to a large extent are the main sponsors of our research, you know, in the individual countries. In your view, maybe turning to Donna, what should be primary on policymakers' minds as the crisis moves forward to recovery? What do you think they'll be thinking of most in the US? Oh, you're on mute.
Sure.
Yeah.
The government, as I mentioned earlier, has played a role of maybe making sure that barriers aren't there. Like, for example, we had a startup act where we allowed crowdfunding, and crowdfunding kind of came out of the private sector. And so the government has traditionally been one that's staying out of the way and making sure that the private sector and free enterprise can thrive. It's really hard to say because we have so much uncertainty coming forward, what the role of government has been in a country where the private sector has been so important. So it'll be hard. I think it'll be important for there to be these public-private partnerships that we're working together to ensure that that everything is really positive and contributing to supporting entrepreneurs.
Okay, and Peter, would you like to add to that in any way?
Yeah, I think there's probably several big issues that would be on the table. One of them was, how do you wind down these support programs doing the least amount of damage? Because in 2020, the forecast is that we will have a budget deficit of over $250 billion in Canada, which is 10-12% or more of GDP. And that's not a sustainable number. So I think the thing that's going to be an issue is how do you actually get out of those programs? The second one is in order to stimulate the recovery, who do you support? Do you support the big companies or the small companies? because we talked before about the last time it was really the big companies, the last crisis. This time it's more the small ones. Support to big companies has been a bit less. So where would you get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of economic growth, supporting the big companies or the small ones? And the third issue, which is probably quite different from in the US, is globalization. Canada is an exporting country. About a third of our GDP comes from exports. And there is a lot of threat right now about globalization. What's going to happen? Will it reverse? How easy will it be to sell products overseas? If exporting becomes more difficult, that's going to be quite a serious problem for Canada. And on the flip side of that, a lot of Canadian companies have outsourced to China and other places. If that reverses, that's going to create a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs in Canada to make products that are currently being made overseas.
Right.
And the last question is, to what extent government, particularly federal government funding, is going to be used to support a green agenda. If you look at the European Union, they're putting together a gigantic support program now, which was very explicitly supporting a green agenda. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Canada.
Great. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing in the last few weeks is looking at our research instruments and modifying them so that they become COVID-19 impact relevant. And so, as you know, right now we're, furiously carrying out the research. By the end of the year, we want to have answers to a number of questions. Those questions hopefully will feed into the very things that you've been referring to, Peter, in terms of the kinds of things that governments will be concerned with monitoring and evaluating. So, Donna, what would you like to say about what kind of questions will the GEM USA team be very keen to be able to answer? You're muted. Yes, thank you.
Good. I just don't want to interfere when Peter's talking.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I just reflecting on what the letter said about the environment and, the fact that we are seeing this change and the impact, positive impact on the environment. And I hope that that will bring not only government change, but also entrepreneurial opportunities with that realization that we can make these changes, these positive changes that have a good impact on the environment. In terms of the GEM results, and really looking forward to the 2020 survey results. And what will be interesting is how it's affecting societal attitudes, because we do tend to see this as a leading indicator, and maybe we will see the change in TEA rates in 2020. But there also might be a little bit of a lag effect, obviously, especially with established businesses. So interesting in the nature of societal attitudes. Actually, in the United States, even in the recession, we see very little change in how people view themselves about capabilities for starting. But then when you ask them, are there opportunities around you, it's highly affected economic situation. And so that varies much more. Also, what will be interesting is, one thing that's been talked about in the United States is how COVID is affecting societal groups differently, like the lower income populations. Is it affecting women, financially, as well as the social impact? Is it, affecting obviously older people versus younger people? So it will be interesting to see how that effect translates to our GEM results, right? So are we seeing that in terms of our not only societal attitudes, but participation in entrepreneurship? And then the other thing that I'd like to try to understand more is we'd like to think, and I think maybe Peter mentioned this, that, being optimistic as we are involved in entrepreneurship, that hopefully this leads to more innovation, right? And more
Right.
to grow businesses. So we can look at whether we would see that impact somehow on the nature of the business.
Okay, we lost Donna for a
And
few seconds.
or
Can you just repeat your last sentence, Donna?
okay, sure. Yeah, can you hear me okay
Yes.
now? Okay,
Yes.
good. I get notices. I live out in the western part of the state and don't always have the greatest internet connection. So the final thing I'd like to look at in the GEM results is how the nature of entrepreneurship might be changing, and whether maybe this crisis changes the types of businesses that are being started, innovation levels, and maybe other things like growth. Maybe even, as Peter said, the globalization. We don't really have a lot of international activity in the US because it's so big and diverse, but there might be an even further impact on that.
Right, Peter, just one last addition, if you like, to that same question on elements that you are particularly interested in terms of the 2020 research and findings.
Yeah, in Canada, we've actually got a really interesting natural experiment going on, because some provinces have been affected far more than others by COVID. I'm thinking of Quebec has been particularly hard hit by the virus, and others have been much less. And we're going to have GEM results on everything. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's a relationship between how severe the COVID effect has been and any impact on entrepreneurship. So that's we don't have to do anything different. We'll get those results just by doing our normal GEM study, which would be very interesting. And I think the other thing is, will we see a surge in entrepreneurship? I think typically that has been the case in the past. As Donna says, will we see more necessity-based entrepreneurship, people with no other opportunities for work having to become entrepreneurs? Will we see an increase in employee entrepreneurial activity? It's a very interesting survey that people working from home are more productive than working in the office. And if this is in fact the case, we might see a boost in productivity. So there are all kinds of curious things that we might look for in the GEM results from this year.
So for our listeners, you probably can conclude that by the end of the year, we're going to have a wealth of information that will actually be very relevant to the current discussion. I actually would like to move to the questions now, because we have a few questions up. Please do add some questions if you have any in the Q&A section of the Zoom app. Thank you, Forrest, for moving to the last slide. So our first question, really they were posed around, when you were looking at the graphs, Donna, why the drop in fear of failure in 2004, and why is fear of failure generally going up? So maybe,
can you switch back to that slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do tend to have fluctuations in our indicators. 2004, I don't recall what was going on at that time, but it appears that it may have been the post after the bubble burst that we maybe have bounced back from that. Why is it going up? It could be the case that we were.
Oh, you cut again.
Did I? Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. In 2019, we really moved.
Looks like we're not going to get an answer to that question easily.
Oh.
Try one more time, Donna.
Okay. Hopefully this will work.
Yeah.
I'll just say at least quickly that when you're in a full employment situation, there are opportunity costs, right? And so if you fail at an entrepreneurial, venture, you've also lost that opportunity to maybe take a good job. So that could be one of the reasons that we're seeing that fear of failure coming up through 2019. Maybe the fear of failure comes up for another reason in 2020 because of the risk of, caused by this crisis.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Nicolas. How are you seeing other entrepreneurship ecosystems like Latin America during this crisis? Actually, there I'm going to suggest that maybe you go back to find the recording. You'll find it on our website, you know, the recordings of all the webinars, because we did actually have a conversation with Chile and Mexico, and that's an interesting one for you to look at. The reason we're having all of these different webinars is because every entrepreneurship ecosystem is really different, and this is one of the characteristics of GEM that is very interesting, is that we can compare and contrast between ecosystems across Latin America and Asia, North America, etc., etc. So don't hesitate to have a look at our website and find those previous recordings. I think that's really the best answer to that. Here we have another question. Do you think policymakers are prepared to face this type of crisis in your countries and apply effective measures in the economic plane? Do they need complementary assessment and in different regions of the world? Maybe Peter, would you like to maybe address that one first? Do you think they are prepared to face this type of crisis?
Well, looking at what's gone on so far, the federal government in Canada has put a lot of programs into place for supporting entrepreneurs, and by and large, it's worked out pretty well. The money they've got the money out the door very quickly, and generally those programs have been quite well received. So, judging by sort of the track record so far, I would say that we definitely seem to be taking effective measures, and I would anticipate this would continue.
Okay. You want to add to that, Donna? Although I actually have a very interesting one for you next.
Go ahead to the next question.
There's quite a lot of questions. Because so you're the person who can answer this best. What about gender? Do you anticipate that businesses will be affected or will come into play with regard to the gender of the entrepreneur or the type of the business? Are women businesses more affected by the crisis than men? Would like to know your perspective.
Well, you know, because we see different effects on different types of businesses, we also know that women tend to start in different sectors. I was just looking at the 2019 results by gender, and men are more likely to start, you know, in manufacturing, transportation. Women are more in a lot of the services, social services, education, and so certainly we would see that as well. And you know, to the extent that we have constraints on funding, you know, we would expect that to also be affected. I'm not, you know, I'm not a women's entrepreneurship researcher, even though I've written some GEM reports in that area. And so others would be able to answer that a little bit better. But, you know, I think just looking at different industries, we can say, yeah.
All right, and here's one. How can the education system induce economic growth, innovation in entrepreneurial ecosystems?
Well, I'd love to answer that. I mean,
okay.
You know, well, we have to adapt as educators, right? We have to think about, you know, as I mentioned before, what are consumers demanding in terms of education? How do they want to be educated? What is technology enabling? Now at Babson, we've gone so much over the in-class experiential effect, right? So that we want the students to interact with each other, to try things, to experiment. I'm on a design team for figuring out how our first year experience can go online. And we're thinking, you know, what are the advantages actually? You know, we don't want to think of going online as being second best. We might be able to offer flexibility. We might be able to teach all over the world and have students team up and learn about cultures in other countries and not think about selling a business on campus to college students, but selling in their communities where they are. So what I'd like to think is that education can leverage both what technology enables and what we might see in terms of possibilities in the market.
I think just to add one comment.
Yeah.
Just to add one comment to that, there's in terms of high school teaching, there was a survey done in Canada from the perspective of the teachers, asking them if they had a choice, would they like to continue teaching online or would they like to go back to the classroom? And I think the vast majority of them wanted to get back to the classroom. Something like 80% of the people responded. So I think that's part of the story as well, that if the teachers don't really like doing I think it's a lot more work. If they don't like doing it online, then that's a factor that's got to be worked in as well.
Right.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I've been interfacing with so many different universities because our main interfaces are university professors who lead the GEM teams. And I must say most haven't been loving the transition and disruption.
Right.
It's been really, really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one last question. It's a financial question. Investors are doubling down on portfolio companies. Will COVID-19 investments be a blip? Certainly it's a gold rush, but not all will make it to market. Anyone got any particular opinion on that one?
Wow.
That's a bit of a yes. Peter, you got
Well,
a view on that?
if you forecast the future, the forecasts are all over the place. Some people, the head of the Bank of Canada thinks that this time next year will be pretty much back to normal. Other people think we'll be in the depths of a deep recession. So I think trying to make predictions about financing at this point is a bit a risky game, shall we say.
I would certainly agree.
Yeah, I agree.
But we're going to have to wrap up, actually. And I think we have had one or two other questions. We'll look at those carefully. We are recording this webinar, so if you want to forward it to any of your colleagues, please do download the recording and forward it. Also, if there's anyone out there who might envisage starting a national team in any country where we do not have a national team, just check out our site, see if there's a country team where you are sitting, and if you're interested in thinking about it, please do contact us. We also carry out ecosystem studies on a regional or city level, so that might be something that you might be interested, and we're always interested, naturally enough, in entities or partners that would be interested in sponsoring GEM reports or other parts of our research. I think we've all enjoyed being with you today, and I've certainly enjoyed listening to Donna and Peter. Thank you so much, Donna and Peter, for taking the time out from your disrupted, busy schedules to be with us. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
It's good to see you too, Peter.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.